Turtle and Tortoise Preservation Group Conference 2022. Richard will be talking on his book.
Our next speaker really doesn't need an introduction. Richard Fife and Jerry Fife have been keeping and breeding tortoises for 15 years? Yeah. So anyway, it's an honor to have Richard here. He's been a mentor to so many, and he was a TTPG board member, and now he's one of our advisors. And I'm excited to hear, and you thought you knew, the African Spurred tortoise.
Really great to see everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah. And you know, one of the things I really worried about was whether I brought a thumb drive, I put it on a laptop, I put it on my cell phone, and then I thought, oh no, you still lost it. Anyway, great speakers, great meeting, and what a wonderful time. And one of the things that I have recognized is that people will do almost anything for their tortoises or turtles. Spend a lot of money if necessary. Anyway, my topic today is, and you thought you knew the African Spurred tortoise. And of course the obvious response is, well, what do you mean? We do. You know, everybody's got one in their backyard. Every third person is breeding them. They've been around in the pet trade since about 1990. And so what is there possibly that we don't know? Well, because I have, and I'm hoping I pushed the right button. Doug showed me which one to push.
That's trouble.
Doug?
Where's Doug? Nice job, Doug. Doug, you had one job.
You told me to not touch those ones.
Oh, Russell.
Yeah, just that.
Oh, I got it. I was going in reverse. You know?
One for one.
Anyway. Because I have such a captive audience, as Russ actually asked me to talk a little bit about my book. It's now available on Amazon, and so actually those things that you thought you do about African spurred tortoises, I'm going to talk about just a little bit. Number one, the African spurred tortoise is one of the most popular pet giant tortoises. And why would they not? I mean, they're... excuse me.
That's a first.
That's when I'm supposed to be over. They are so very, very personable. I was out working in my yard, and I thought, somebody's watching me. And I turned around, and I had half a dozen African spurred tortoises just watching me dig. This one in the wheelbarrow, I used to take my kids on wheelbarrow rides, and what do you think? You think that guy's enjoying that ride? I think he is. Oh, there, that guy. The first thing I wanted to talk about just a little bit is to give you an idea that the African spurred tortoise has not been in the pet trade for a very long time. And you can look at some of the numbers. If you look down, and I'm going to hopefully, U.S. imports, 96, 97, those were the years when we had a lot of them coming in. And then, of course, something happened in about the year 2000. And that's when the heartwater tick showed up on some African spurred tortoises. And the United States Department of Agriculture realized that the African spurred tortoises were coming in from a part of Africa where the heartwater tick was, that was not in the United States yet, and they hoped that it would never be in the United States. So they immediately, almost overnight, shut down the importation of African spurred tortoises, leopard tortoises, and Bell's hingeback tortoises. And since then, they have restricted the interstate movement of any of those three species without a health certificate verifying that they're free of ticks. The African spurred tortoise is considered to be the third largest species of tortoise in the world, with only the Galapagos tortoise and the Aldabra tortoise larger. However, the leopard tortoise from Ethiopia and Somalia, as well as the yellowfoot tortoise from the Great Basin area of South America, are reported to grow to about 32 inches, which is coming pretty close to the size that some of our African spurred tortoises get to. Of course, the African spurred tortoise is typical of most of our tortoises. And the largest African spurred tortoises come from the country of Sudan, with reports of males reaching 44 inches. So you can see that really surpasses the size of even our giant leopard tortoises and our giant yellowfoot tortoises. And over 300 pounds. It's been suggested that these tortoises from the Sudan should be separated into subspecies, but that has not happened. To give you an idea of the size, they get just huge. There was also a large land tortoise was found in the Cape Verde Islands, about 350 miles off the west coast of Africa. The remains were identified in 1935 to be very, very similar to the African spurred tortoise, and it was called atlantica. And I don't know if any of you have had an opportunity to see that tortoise, and so here are the remains of that tortoise.
Huge.
Well, I got a little more than that. Anyway, it's interesting that there are other large tortoises that were established around the world on other islands and other places. Okay, when I started to put my book together, I started to look at where are these tortoises found. And so I took all the information from a number of different authors and researchers to determine exactly where they were, where the larger populations were, where individual animals or tortoises have been found. And you can see their range runs right across Africa through the area called the Sahel region of Africa, just south of the Sahara Desert. Now, as we look at it a little bit closer, some of the literature that was out there says that the range extended all the way into Ethiopia, and specifically to the Awash National Park in Ethiopia, which is where that blue arrow is pointing. And so Jerry and I went to Ethiopia. Just happened to be that my daughter and 4 of my grandkids lived in Ethiopia at the time, which made that very great. And we traveled all over Ethiopia. We never, ever found an African spurred tortoise or a burrow or any indication that, other than in the extreme northern part of Ethiopia, which we did not get to, but the rest of Ethiopia, they are not African spurred tortoises. Now, you can see 2 of my grandkids beside a giant tortoise. Not quite the right shape for an African spurred tortoise. But if you were a biologist and weren't a turtle guy or a tortoise guy, you would assume that that was an African spurred tortoise. Whereas in fact, this is the largest one that Jerry and I found, and it was 29 inches. That's 5 inches larger than the largest leopard tortoise found in South Africa. And to give you an idea of the size, it's right next to an 18-inch leopard tortoise. So you can see that's a huge leopard tortoise, but it's not an African spurred tortoise. The next thing that I wanted to do is I looked into African spurred tortoises, and I've been working with them ever since the first ones were imported in the United States in the early 90s. I wanted to look at the climate, and I've highlighted in blue up there on the top actually 5 specific locations, and you can see I'm also comparing the climate data, in this case minimum temperatures, to Phoenix, Arizona and Miami, Florida, to give you an idea. Now, one of the first things that I noticed was the temperature minimum temperature in January and February. And take a look at it. At all of these areas, the minimum temperature is about 60 degrees. And if you look on the very bottom, it shows you the record cold temperature, and that's all the way across Africa through the Sahel. You see any record cold that's even near freezing? Doesn't happen. Does not freeze in their range. Now the next thing I want you to look at is these temperatures in April and May. And it's like, wait a second, that's not all that hot. April and May, it's really hot. This is the one I wanted to show you. It was July and August. And it's like, wait a minute. It's not that hot. It's hardly even 90 degrees. Well, in the summer, that part of Africa gets a very distinct monsoon, kind of like southeast Arizona. And the rains come in and the temperature goes down. And another thing that happens, got to make sure I got the right slide up there, is take a look at how much water or how much rain they get. If you compare that to Phoenix of 7.66 inches, of course Miami, and we know Miami is wet at 55.91 inches, but look at some of these cities, 39 inches of rain. This is perhaps a desert tortoise that we don't really understand. Most of the year, it's completely dry. But when the monsoons come in, the rains come in. The temperature drops, the humidity goes up, and the grass grows, and all of a sudden these giant tortoises start crawling out of their burrows. Well, that one guy's not a tortoise. That's Jerry. But it gives you an idea of the size of these burrows. And there are records of these burrows going 50 feet into the ground. And a couple of things that happen, and this goes a little bit when we talk about humidity and the need for humidity, so that not only our hatchlings will grow and develop properly, but so that our adult tortoises, African spurred tortoises, think of it. Here you've got a tortoise that's active during the time of the year when they get a foot of rain. And so these tortoises spend most of their time way deep down in the burrow. In most of my experience, that's where they do an awful lot of their poop. And what comes with that? Moisture and humidity. So again, we think we've got a dry land desert tortoise that needs it hot and dry, and they do need some heat, but they need that humidity. The next thing that I looked into over the years, because I bred African spurred tortoises, and I wanted to be able to figure out whether I had males or females. And I wanted to figure out that as early on as I possibly could. So over a period of 25 years, I started looking at every African spurred tortoise adult that I could find. And of course, we've all heard that you can tell the sex because they're concave and a big tail. And, that's pretty much it. Well, as I began to look at African spurred tortoises, take a look at these scutes. Hopefully you can hear. Take a look at these scutes, and this is a female on this side. The length versus the width compared to a male, the length versus the width. And as I went through more and more African spurred tortoises, that was 100% of the time. Now, as they're young, it's almost the same. But as they mature and they develop, I began to see that, and as they were fully mature, that was 100% of the time. Now, whether that crosses over to some of the other species of tortoises, I don't know. The next thing that I began to know, and people talked about this a little bit, were the anal scutes. Again, we've got our female, and if you look at this angle, females predominantly have that angle at 90 degrees or greater. Males, less than 90 degrees. Of course, one of the most obvious ways to tell the sex is the size of the tail. And when they hatch out, the tail's pretty much same size. But as males begin to mature, they begin to develop a larger tail. The anal scutes thicken, resulting in a concave plastron. And of course, all these pictures, or almost everything I'm showing you, is again, this is sort of an advertisement for my book. The information is in there. Of course, here we have a picture of a male on the top and a female on the bottom. The other thing that I've done, I moved from Phoenix to Southeast Arizona. And Southeast Arizona doesn't get brutally cold, nothing like Indiana. But it's a little bit colder than what the African spurred tortoise likes. So I began to create these straw bale tortoise houses. And our temperature, for a few hours a night, several times a year, will drop down to about 20 degrees. These barns had inside 3/4 inch thick plywood box. I had high density styrofoam underneath it, and then I stuccoed it, and I mounted a cane pig blanket on the back wall. You never want to put it on the floor because they poop on it, straw gets on it, and I had them catch on fire twice for me. There's nothing more terrifying than to look out at your tortoise yards and seeing smoke coming out of their tortoise houses. But I found by putting these pig blankets on the back wall, and they consumed 85 watts, less than a 100-watt light bulb, and I could get my tortoises to start producing or laying eggs probably ahead of anybody else in Phoenix because they kept warm enough during the winter. Now, the other thing that's interesting, where I live, it snows. And when it snows, the tortoises come out and bask. Now, you remember when we looked at those low temperatures, it never freezes in their range. Well, these tortoises, if you would walk up, and I did, and I touched that tortoise to make sure it's okay, and it's warm, they need full sun. Now, where I'm at 5,000 feet elevation, so the intensity of the sun is pretty intense. But those tortoises were hot, even though they're sitting and basking in the sun. So the importance is you need to be concerned about how cold it'll get, but more important, you need to make sure that the sun is shining. They would begin to decline and die if the temperatures were at 60 degrees and cloudy compared to 50 degrees and sunny. At least you get the idea. The other question I had a lot of people ask, well, Richard, how deep do you dig their walls down so they can't dig out? Well, I don't. In fact, because I had a lot of tortoises and it cost a lot of money to build walls, I used high-density polyethylene root liner. And I wired that onto a field fence, and it didn't go down under the ground at all. An African spurred tortoise, when they dig a burrow, they go down, they don't come back up out some other tunnel. They turn around and they come right back out the way they went in. Now, they do like to nest up against walls, bushes, high-density polyethylene root liner. And so a female may be backed in there laying her eggs, and the other side might collapse because the ground was not stable enough, but they didn't do it intentionally. The other thing I wanted to look at was diet. Now, I thought one of the things that I had a lot of information on were desert tortoises, and it's like, well, the African spurred tortoise can't be a whole lot different than our desert tortoise. They come from areas where the same type of forbs and weeds and plants grow. And so this row are the protein levels, the calcium phosphate ratios, the fat, the fiber, and so forth for the desert tortoise. And one of the things that I saw that was, really, really close, and without mixing stuff, we can't be exactly right, but was Bermuda grass. And alfalfa is not too far off. It's a little higher in protein, and that protein in alfalfa varies. The first cuttings are very high, but here in the valley, they'll get up to 7 cuttings. Some of those later cuttings are not nearly as high in protein. But tortoises need protein also. And I fed my tortoises literally tons of alfalfa and never saw any problem with high protein issues. Oh, there we are. I was supposed to show that one because I have those highlighted. Okay, the next surprise that I had, I went out into my tortoise yard, and I don't know how he did it, but he caught a rabbit. And I thought, wow, nobody will ever believe this. I mean, we're used to, maybe the story of the hare and the tortoise, and the hare got lazy and the tortoise beat it out, but I never thought that the tortoise could actually catch the rabbit and then eat it. So I ran into the house, and by the time I got out, he had the rabbit more than halfway down. I should have, I guess, said that, you know, if you're bothered by, you know, yeah, hide your eyes, sorry. Okay, another thing that's very important, which has been discussed already, the importance of water. When it rains, and again, the part of Africa, through most of their range, they get a lot of summer rain. And that's when they come out and drink, and they drink, and they drink. And I noticed that my African spurred tortoises, they didn't just drink from their mouth, but they stuck their whole face in it, and it almost appeared as though they were drinking it and sucking it up their nose. The other thing, of course, that they use the water for is they get a mud puddle and they start flipping that mud all over their back to either protect them, insulate them maybe a little bit better, or protect them from insects. Not exactly sure. Now, when their hydration levels are right, we see this, their uric acid. Now, one of the first things that people that I sold my tortoises to would call is, Richard, I don't know what's going on. They just pooped out all this white gunk. If it's about this consistency, that's fine. If it comes out in chunks, guess what? They don't have enough water. Now, I just briefly put here chapter 7 from my book to give you some of the ideas and some of the issues that we deal with as far as health. External parasites. Of course, that's why we can't import leopard tortoises or African spurred tortoises or hingeback tortoises in the United States because of external parasites. Internal parasites, of course, can be a real issue. Another thing that I dealt with radiated tortoises is intranuclear coccidia that travels all the way into their brain. Fortunately, this has not been found in African spurred tortoises. Salmonella. You know, one of the things when we think about small turtles and tortoises are kids getting salmonella. So any turtle or tortoise or lizard or snake, we need to educate ourselves concerning salmonella. But tortoises can also, well, they obviously can contract salmonella. And as when I was exporting, I had to make sure that my tortoises were salmonella free and the hatchlings were salmonella free because they had to be tested for salmonella before I could ship them to Hong Kong and then throughout Southeast Asia and mainland China. Soft shell and wasting syndrome. Lot of questions. Why is my tortoise declining? Is it because of moisture? Is it because of parasites? Is it because my calcium and phosphorus levels are wrong? What about vitamin D3? And I go into that in my book, Pyramiding. Again, at our last meeting last year and again today, the importance of humidity and moisture.
Missed a second there, but just making sure that you're still awake.
Upper respiratory tract disease. So again, I tried to cover a lot of the issues that we deal with, not only with African spurred tortoises, but also with a lot of other species of tortoises. Prerequisites for breeding. I have a whole chapter on that. The importance of adequate moisture, of calcium, and a suitable diet, and an enclosure, and the type of soil and ground conditions that you need to have. And of course, if you're successful, and when I say successful, actually it means if you're feeding them okay and keeping them warm enough and giving them water, then what do? They start nesting and laying eggs. And I want to show you something. And if you look really close in this slide, maybe you can see this. Your female has to have enough, she has to be hydrated enough, have had enough water so that she can produce this mucus sleeve or mucus slide. If not, when she lays the eggs, they drop. And the egg that they hit cracks, and the one that dropped cracked. And of course, hopefully we come up with a box of eggs. And then it's very important to be able to know how to handle that egg. I go into, as you can read here, the parts of the egg and the importance they play with that tortoise. When I go into the chapter on incubation, how important it is to have the right humidity levels, what happens if it's too dry, and how that egg is going to successfully, the embryo in that egg is going to successfully develop and hatch. I also go into how to determine if your egg is fertile. And of course, this is a candling method. And you can see the layers within that egg and the developing embryo from the blood veins. Another method that I used was this Buddy Digital Egg Monitor. And you can see the heartbeat of that egg. And I thought, wow, all my troubles are over. No longer do I need to leave my eggs in the incubator until they explode. But unfortunately, it turns out you don't start seeing the heartbeat of the embryo in your egg until about 3 weeks or so before it hatches. In 2004, I collaborated with Oklahoma State University, particularly Day Ligon, because I wanted to find out, we knew that most turtles and tortoises are temperature sex determinant, but I wanted to know exactly why. So we spent several years and came up with the following information. And as this study was being taken care of and done, we also thought, well, there's got to be some other way to tell whether a hatchling tortoise was a male or female. And so we also looked at hormone levels, estrogen and testosterone. And the equipment they had at the university wasn't delicate enough, so they brought in even more delicate equipment. And unfortunately, we couldn't find anything that would tell us whether it was a male or female, a young hatchling tortoise. But you can see these temperatures. At 83 degrees, 100% males. 85 degrees, and I'm using Fahrenheit. We actually did everything in Celsius, so the numbers round off a little better for those of you who like round numbers. At 85, 100% males. 86, we're starting to get a few females in the mix, 25 or 24% females and 76% males. And through estimating, we figure that the temperature where you get about 50% males and 50% females is 87.4 degrees. We've got 94% females at 88.7 and 100% females at 90.5. Also at 90.5, that's about almost too hot, because that's when you start getting all the shell imperfections. I also found out, and it wasn't in this study, but that I could produce females at about 82 degrees, but they hatched out very weak and seldom survived. It's one of my little ivory tortoises poking its nose out. Well, I told you about the eggs dropping onto another egg. Sometimes the opening between the shell for the female, and she pushes those eggs out that are a little bit too big, and they end up being cracked or dented or broken. And so I found an easy solution was to go down to the hardware store or Walmart or wherever you shop and get some low temperature hot glue, and I glued them back together. And you can see these pictures here. All of these hatchlings, you can still see the glue on them, and they hatched. And this one, this one, it was broken on the top and the bottom, and I glued it back together, and it hatched. Okay, then the next thing I was concerned with, and this was sort of is it the chicken before the egg, or the egg before the chicken? Well, one morning I went out, and I checked my eggs, and actually that picture that the ivory tortoise nose, it should have been right here in the slides. I looked, and I had a dark-eyed albino African spurred tortoise that hatched out of the egg. First one that I'd ever heard of. And so then I began to look at the genetics to see what I need to do to take control of this. Because obviously there was some monetary potential there and some excitement. And so in my book, I go into a little bit on genetics and how you can manipulate, your males and females and your hets and so forth to get a result that you can understand. And so we've got the dark-eyed albinos, which the tyrosinase enzyme is what creates the melanin in your tortoises. So the dark-eyed albino is often referred to as the T positive, and then of course the pink-eyed albino is the T negative, meaning that enzyme is not present. There on the lower left, I even hatched out some that had what people referred to as ruby eye, but those were T positive albinos. And then I produced some completely white ones and yellow ones. And when we talk about terminology, leucistic typically means white. And hypomelanistic, hypo means less than normal. Melanin is, of course, the dark pigment. So as people start developing different morphs, these are some of the terms that are used. Now, often I have the question if somebody comes up and we look at the one on the left and they say, what have I come up with? Is this a hypomelanistic tortoise? And I say, not really, because the one on the left and the one on the right came out of the same clutch, and within about 6 months, they looked exactly the same compared to the ivory tortoise in the middle. A friend of mine in Buckeye came up with what he refers to as the albino paradox, African Spurred tortoise. And of course, this is one of Andrew's tortoises, and I appreciate him and others who gave me pictures that I could put in the book. The next thing that we wondered about was, well, what about hybridization? Well, William Corwin in California, his African Spurred tortoise bred with his leopard tortoise, and guess what? We got viable eggs. So there's still a lot of work to be done with the African Spurred tortoise. This is one of my ivory tortoises. It's a wonderful species to work with if you have the room and you have the commitment. And here are some of my tortoises, and the tortoise on the upper right, this is an example of when your tortoise has the proper moisture and humidity level, as was spoken about earlier, during, well, from the moment it hatches for, as long as you're able to keep those proper levels until it goes outside. Now this ivory tortoise, you can see it's missing one of its central scutes, but perfectly smooth because of the proper humidity in raising it as a hatchling. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Good. Oh, I can say good. That means everyone's going to go buy my book.
Okay, you showed the picture of the leucistic.
Yes.
Do you have a photo of that thing mature? Somewhere?
No. One of my problems is, in fact, I was talking to somebody earlier because I also produce hypomelanistic spotted turtles. And they say, well, do you have any pictures of them mature? And it's like, no, somebody always offers me more than I can. But no, I don't. However, I have noticed that some of those ones that came out really, really white, new growth is always darker, and so they kind of averaged out. And also, African Spurred tortoises that are kept inside for much of their life are much darker than animals that are kept outside, obviously because the sun bleaches them out.
Richard, you mentioned the really low temperature sulcatas for females, but sort of wimpy. Have you noticed any robustness difference in low temperature males and higher temperature males? Or, I mean, that'd be a quirky thing to notice, and it'd be hard to track it, but have you ever noticed that?
No, I haven't. Okay, thank you.